Okay, this next one is continuing looking through the text of Revelation, this time looking at the 7 seals. So like I said, from now on, until we get to the millennium, I'm going to go through each of these scenes, each of these sections, looking at the 4 main views, historicist, preterist, futurist, idealist, and seeing briefly how they interpret this section, each of these sections. So we'll go through this kind of pattern all the way through. So dealing firstly with the seals, chapters 4 to 7. Here we have the scene of the heavenly throne room, the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures. We have some photos there of some Assyrian living creatures with the wings and different heads for the British Museum. Might have looked something like that, I don't know. But the focus of this section is this scroll with its 7 seals. John is there in the heavenly throne room and he's weeping because no one can open this sealed scroll. But then enter the Lamb. Jesus is introduced to the scene, and he of course is worthy to open the seals. So what is going on here? Well, for the historicists, for them the scroll with these seals represent the purposes of God. God's plan for history. So all of the future events of church history, so all of the events described in Revelation are contained in this scroll. So if you like, they come from God. It's God's plan. But nobody has the authority to carry out God's plan apart from the Lamb. Jesus comes along and has the authority to make these things happen. God plans, Christ fulfills. The unsealing of the scroll for the historicists, the focus is the Roman Empire. For them, this is the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire, the start of its downfall. So the empire, which for them would be, the focus would be the great persecutors of the church. And they would see this book written in Domitian's time. And in Domitian's time, it's the emperor persecuting the church, the state persecuting the church. So the focus for them then is the great persecutor of the church. The Roman Empire is going to fall. And these scrolls are talking about the beginning of its fall, beginning in Domitian's time. So they're saying within this persecution of Domitian, Jesus is saying to the church, your persecutor is going to fall. Christ is sovereign over Rome, and Rome, the enemy of the church, will be defeated. You may not see it in your lifetime, but it will happen. The blood of the martyrs will be vindicated. So for historicists, these seals are a series of events or time periods in Roman history. The first seal is seen as the high point of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, under the 4 great emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. After these 4 great men, though, in Roman viewpoint, it's all downhill from then on for the Roman Empire. This is where you get the decline. Firstly, from within. Chaos within the Roman Empire because of mad or bad emperors, civil wars, famines, etc. And then dangers from outside of the empire. The barbarians, all the people that have lived outside of the Roman walls, of the Roman world, who have long wanted to get in and join in and take from the riches, they begin, as the empire begins to weaken, they begin to attack the empire and invade. So the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, and so on. This is talking about the 4th and the 5th century AD, when these barbarian invasions come in and weaken the empire even more. The 144,000, for the historicists, they represent spiritual Israel. 12 being religious number times itself, times 1,000, the human number cubed, or God the government, big amount. So if you like, godly religious humanity, spiritual Israel, which for historicists would be, of course, the church. So for them, The 144,000 represents the church that God protects throughout this chaotic time, protecting both from Rome itself, the persecutors, and the fall of their persecutors from the invaders. So God keeps the church intact throughout the fall of the Roman Empire, throughout these invasions. Now, of course, many Christians die within this time period, both killed by Romans and by barbarians, but the church as a whole survive. God protects the remnant of his people throughout this time period. The Prejudice. For them, the scroll can be one of two things. One, it could be, if you like, the spiritual death sentence of Jerusalem. God has decreed that Jerusalem will fall, and the Lamb, Jesus, is the one with the authority to bring it to part, to carry out this sentence of judgment on Jerusalem. Thinking again in terms of the persecuted church, the first great persecutor of the church was the Jewish state, was the Jewish institution. So this, if you like, is God destroying the institution that persecuted his bride. Or it could be representing the new covenant. This is because fundamental to the preterist approach is this idea that Revelation, if you like, represents the final end of the old covenant, or the final transition from the old to the new covenant. Because of this focus on the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, what the preterists say is that Revelation is talking about how there can no longer ever be an old covenant. When Jerusalem falls, the entire old covenant system falls too. The temple, the priesthood, and so on. No one can approach God through the old covenant anymore. It no longer works. It is gone. After 70 AD, it was no longer possible for anyone to prove that they were a priest, a descendant of Levi, because all the records are gone. And we know from Ezra that you have to be able to prove that you're a priest in order to be a priest. So now it's impossible to have an old covenant priesthood. So it's the end. So the only way to approach God is now through the new covenant, not the old. Preterists are not anti-Old Covenant, but they love the Old Testament. But what they're saying is that the Old Testament is now over. The Old Covenant cannot be reborn because the New Covenant is the only way to approach God. Essentially, they're saying that Hebrews and Revelation are talking about the same thing. Hebrews is talking about it theologically, and Revelation is talking about it apocalyptically. And so that is why many of them say that this scroll is the New Testament. That the unsealing of the scroll is the outworking of the New Testament. And part of that is the destruction of Jerusalem, destruction of the old, the removal of the old. They point out similarities between Revelation and the Olivet Discourse. So these series of seals are a series of judgments on Jerusalem. The first horse being the Romans conquering Judea, the second representing the slaughter of the warfare, the third the economic hardship that follows, the conditions in the city. The fourth is the death and famine which come with siege. And to a certain extent, all of these four views look at the horsemen in the same way. It's just which army is doing the conquering, who is suffering and who is being besieged is different depending on the view. The 144,000 are seen as the Jewish Christians who fled Jerusalem. Now, no Jewish Christian died during the fall of Jerusalem. This is because they remembered what Jesus had said to them all those years ago. And when they saw the signs happening, they left. And they fled to Pella, which is in modern-day Jordan. And so for the preterists, the 144,000 are Israel. Spiritual Israel, the mother church, the Jerusalem church, who are saved from the destruction. Futurists. They tend to see the scroll as being the title deed of earth. So it's like God owns the earth and this scroll is his title deed. And Jesus reclaims it. It's a symbol of Christ taking back authority over all the earth, saying, only I have authority. For the dispensationalists, this coincides with the rapture of the church. They would point to when the trumpet sounds in 4:1 and then John goes up to heaven, that actually is a picture of the church being raptured. So for the dispensationalists, from now on, this point in the book, the church is in heaven watching these events happening on the earth. For them, this is the end of the church age and dispensation of grace. And for the rest of the book, God now focuses on his other people, Israel. And so the saints from now on are Israel's return to Christ. Though for historical premillennialists, they don't believe that, and what they would say is that this is just the beginning of the Antichrist rule, of the end time, the tribulation. That's what the seals are. But the focus is the church still. They are going through this. So the 144,000 are different depending on which futurist you are. For the dispensationalists, they represent Israel, that are protected. The Israel that returns to God are protected through the tribulation. The historical premillennialists, it's spiritual Israel. It's the church who is protected through the tribulation. So these seals are the beginning of the end. The Antichrist conquering. The destruction caused by his kingdom. The beginning of the judgments falling on the tribulation. Bringing war, famine, hardship, etc. Idealists. For them, the scroll represents God's redemptive plan. Or as some have put it, the last will and testament of God, which sounds kind of weird because it means that it kind of implies that God's about to die. But the idea is that it's God's will, is what God wants to happen, his salvation plan for humanity. And again, similar to the other views, it's planned by God but enacted through Jesus. He alone has the power to unseal it. And so the unsealing for the idealists is a picture of God working through Christ in human history. Every time God interrupts history, every time he sovereignly acts in the world to judge and further his saving plan. So these seals are a cycle of war, famine, judgment, etc. throughout history. They show how God is always sovereign over the nations. Similar to the Old Testament prophet idea of Yahweh rising up empires and throwing them down. So a picture of God's sovereign judgment throughout history. But similar to the prophets, God always protects a remnant through these judgments. And for them, they are the 144,000. Again, representing spiritual Israel, the church, which are protected throughout these judgments of history. Again, they don't see these as being specific events that will happen, but a series, a cycle of events that will always happen throughout history.